Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show on iTunes, or use our RSS feed with your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and SoundCloud as vmspod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and on Tumblr at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. You can support this podcast and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. Every week you'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my monthly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Now, if you're listening to this one in close to real time, and I really wish you guys did, because when people listen like 6 months later and then they cite something from that one to me in the present, I really don't know what they're talking about. So try and listen when this first comes out, would you? Anyway, if you're doing that this time around, you are in luck, because this week's episode is sort of a preview for the Festival Neue Literatur, which is taking place March 2nd through 5th, 2017, for those of you latecomers. The festival is this collaboration among New York's, well, as they put it, New York's leading German-language cultural institutions. And that's the Austrian Cultural Forum New York, the Consulate General of Switzerland, German Consulate New York, Deutsches Haus at Columbia University, Deutsches Haus at NYU, the Frankfurt Book Fair New York Incorporated, formerly known as the German Book Office, the Goethe Institute New York, and Pro Helvetia, or Helvetia. They're going to kill me however I pronounce it. So anyway, the whole idea with FNL, as we're going to call the Festival Neue Literatur for the rest of this episode, and bring in 2 authors apiece from Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, and pair them up with English language authors and translators for a series of panels and events. And I helped promote the event last year. I interviewed the festival's curator for that year, Ross Benjamin, one of the German authors, Christopher Klobel. And at the kickoff event, the Thursday night of that weekend, I discovered they were giving out a prize, the Friedrich Ulfers Prize, to an important figure in translation of German language work. And the guy who won that year, my wife and I were sitting there in the audience thinking, holy crap, you got to go interview that guy. His name is Burton Pike, and we recorded that one a few weeks after FNL 2016. It was a great podcast, I think. Anyway, this time around, getting to things a little bit late, FNL is coming this week. Again, the kickoff event is Thursday, March 2nd, and then the panels and events take place March 3rd through 5th. And you can find out more about it by going to festivalneuliteratur.org. New is N-E-U-E, and literature is literature without the E on the end. If you check the show notes for this episode, you'll find the link there. So the theme for this year's FNL, last year was humor in German. This time around, it's queer as Volk. So a lot of LGBTQ authors, and, well, a bunch of the panels are going to be revolving around that. The festival website has a list of the 20-odd participants, including the ones who are coming over that I'd mentioned, as well as English language writers like Francine Prose and Daryl Pinckney, the great translator Susan Bernofsky, editor John Freeman. I would name some of the German language authors, but I'm afraid I'll mangle their names and they'll get mad at me. But during FNL weekend, I am hoping to record with one of them, Antje Ravik-Strubel, unless it's Ravich, in which case I just mispronounced her name. And I've already recorded one with this year's Ulfer Prize winner, Barbara Epler, the publisher at New Directions. And that's going to go up next week. It's a really fun conversation. So if you're around the first weekend in March in New York, visit festivalneuliteratur.org and come out for some of the events. Now, our guest this time around is Garth Greenwell, who's the chairperson for FNL 2017. Given that the theme is queer as Volk, Garth is uniquely qualified to help put this one together. I first heard about Garth last summer when I was interviewing Willard Spiegelman, one of my recurring guests, and asked him, "So, who you reading?" And he loved Garth's debut novel, What Belongs to You, which came out early in 2016. Then in, early January, I was recording with Brad Gooch about his Rumi memoir and asked him the same question. And lo and behold, What Belongs to You is one of the novels he's currently reading. So on the strength of those two recommending it, I figured, this is probably a book I need to check out. And then when it turned out that Garth is the chairperson for FNL 2017, we decided to get together and sit down and record while he's in New York for the event. Now, What Belongs to You recently came out in paperback from Picador, and it's an amazing piece of work. It's got this nameless narrator who is an American teacher in Bulgaria, and he's gay and out, and while cruising in the bathrooms under the National Palace of Culture in Sofia, he meets a guy with whom he has a complicated relationship. It is a beautifully interior novel. The narrator alternately reveals and obscures himself throughout, and the writing is just absolutely glorious. And it all makes for this really deep exploration of desire and shame and what we try to communicate to one another with language and without. It's just a daunting first novel. I'm really amazed. And it comes in at under 200 pages, so it's not like he had to go, epic in scope to do this. Plus, it's got the great evocative, he does a great job of evoking the uprootedness and the sense of not quite getting the joke that comes from being in a foreign country where you barely know the language. It's really just a fantastic debut novel. And you could see from the threads that I mentioned, the idea of, the LGBTQ side, the life in translation, et cetera, why Garth is really qualified to be the chairperson for this year's FNL. Now, as caveats go, we recorded at the apartment of another upcoming guest, Jeff Nunakawa. So you'll hear Jeff open and close some doors every so often. And there's traffic noise because it's New York City. Also, right near the end, Jeff takes a shower. So you're going to hear some water in the background. But that's pretty much it. You're used to it by now. And here's Garth's bio. Garth Greenwell is the author of What Belongs to You, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and shortlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and the LA Times Book Prize. A New York Times Book Review editor's choice, it was named a Best Book of 2016 by the New York Times, The New Yorker, Publishers Weekly, and over 50 other publications. His work has appeared in the Paris Review, The New Yorker, the London Review of Books, and elsewhere. He lives in Iowa City. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Garth Greenwell. It's been about a year since the book came out. What's been the most surprising element of the reception of the book?
Well, just that there was any, really. I mean, yeah. I really did expect the book to just kind of disappear without a trace. Mm-hmm. And it's very gratifying that it got, a response. The thing, I can't really say that it was surprising because I knew it was going to be a kind of overwhelming thing, but then it was much more so than I could have predicted, was being in Bulgaria in October for the release of the Bulgarian translation. And I spent a week there talking about the book, and that was just an overwhelming experience and surprising in all sorts of ways. It, we did an event, we did the launch for the book at the National Palace of Culture, just meters from where the novel begins. Yeah. And
meters vertically from
yeah,
where it begins?
meters vertically. That's actually exactly right. And you know, the room, a bunch of people, you know, just all of these people came, and all of these kind of older gay men came and talked to me about, you know, what it was like being gay in Sofia before the fall of communism, and how, in fact, you know, things that I had just, stories I had never heard, and stories that, you know, I don't think anyone in the West knows that much about, but the way in which, you know, in Sofia, which was, you know, not a big city, and so there weren't even underground sort of clubs or bars of any kind for gay people to meet each other. And so, you know, the gay community that these people had consisted of these publicly maintained bathrooms throughout the city. And so I just, you know, just learning some of that there's this incredible cruising history in Bulgaria, I had no idea. And then just the sort of, you know, having the book reflected back to me, both by the place and then also by the people in that place, that was the most remarkable thing that happened in the year of the book's coming out.
Do you plan on returning to Bulgaria frequently, or is it mainly in the rearview mirror at this point?
Well, you know, I don't think it'll ever be in the rearview mirror. I've gone back every year since leaving. So I left in 2013. And I've gone back every year, and I've spent, you know, a good chunk of time every year. I don't know if that will continue being the case. I can't imagine ever feeling like Bulgaria is sort of cleanly in the past. I mean, I have so many friends and so many, you know, I feel such a debt to the place.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't know if it will be as central as it's been for the last, going on 8 years.
Now, you taught there, you taught high school.
That's right.
There, and the experience from that inspires a novel. You'd mentioned in previous interviews that, well, there wasn't an out gay culture there. And as an American, you weren't in any danger of being outed. It was you were privileged in a sense of being this guy who could be openly gay in this world. Were you prepared for that sort of responsibility or mantle of being a figure who was, I can be an example of being outwardly gay in this world where it was otherwise the locals were not able to have that same freedom?
Well, that's, you know, there
I was going to use the term burden, and I realized that would be loaded with so much connotation.
You know, it's a difficult question. So
did you realize it as a responsibility at any point, or did you just feel?
I did come to feel that it was a responsibility. You know, it's not true that I was sort of the only openly gay person. I mean, there has been an increasingly important activist movement in Bulgaria, especially since 2007 when Bulgaria joined the EU, and there are incredibly sort of heroic and enduring activists in Bulgaria. And, you know, and by the time I arrived, there was an established pride parade in its second year when I arrived. So there was, and there is a gay club, or there was a gay club. There is a gay club in Bulgaria, a big gay club, and there were little bars that would sort of disappear and come and go. So it's not quite true. I mean, it's not true to say that there was no gay culture. There was.
Okay.
But certainly, you know, being out meant something very different there. And, you know, it was the case that in my school, I was the only out person. And, you know, I had Bulgarian colleagues who would talk to me and who I knew were gay and who felt very sure that if they came out, they would be fired. And I think that was true. And so that, you know, I did kind of come to realize, you know, what that meant. And it, you know, it meant that I got to have a lot of sort of, really wonderful conversations with students, with adults. It also meant, you know, a kind of constant abrasive relationship to the community, not so much the students. You know, it was interesting and really very moving to sort of see the student response. It seems like every year, because, there is this style of masculinity in Bulgaria, this, it's one of the things I wanted to explore in my book, this sort of machismo culture in Bulgaria.
I'm sort of envisioning the wild Czechoslovakian brothers from the old Saturday Night Live skit, but only because the one Bulgarian I knew in grad school was this 6'4" strapping macho guy with the silk polyester shirts. But go on. Sorry.
I mean, it's not hugely off, actually. Right. To a certain extent. And, and I had, I taught 10th and 12th grade. And so, I would have these kids who were sort of learning that culture, who were growing into that culture, and these sort of very macho, 16-year-olds. And it was wonderful to see what happened over the course of a year, because it is such a, it's such a deeply homophobic culture. I mean, homophobia is just so pervasive. And so, of course, they would arrive with certain attitudes. And then you see what happens when, those attitudes are confronted with a reality every day over the course of a year. And that was, that's a kind of remarkable thing to sort of see. And I remember my last year, this wonderful kid named Peter, who was one of these like macho, his bodybuilder sort of kids. And he came up to me at the end of the year and he said, when I arrived, I had certain ideas about gay people, and I feel ashamed of those ideas now. And, that was a remarkable thing. And you do sort of feel like, right, I mean, what causes attitudes to change is not rational argument, but instead human example. I mean, it really is the fact that when you engage with a human being day after day, it's very hard to hold on to those myths you have of what a gay person is. Adults were a different question. And it was a kind of constant struggle against the administration, and a kind of constant sense that especially the Bulgarian administration, which was all of the administration almost except for the president, in this sense that it's inappropriate for a teacher to be out with his students. It's inappropriate for there to be any kind of concern for LGBT kids in schools. And that put me in a position that finally felt kind of untenable or unbearable, of sort of feeling that there was so little I could do to make the institution care about the most vulnerable students. Mm-hmm. And every year there would be incidents that would just be heartbreaking. And that was very different from teaching in America. Teaching in America, where there is an understanding, I think even as we continue to have conversations and very painful debates about trans rights, etc., there is a kind of fundamental acceptance that a school has to be a safe place, and that adults in a school have a responsibility to engineer that safety. And that is just not a sort of common understanding in Bulgaria. And that was painful. And that did feel like a burden then. Mm-hmm.
And Bulgaria was just an accident for you, or a 50-50
It really was pretty, yeah, that's right. I mean, it really was pretty much an accident. I wanted to teach abroad. Of the options that became available, it seemed by far the most interesting. And then I did have one Bulgarian friend from music school. I went to conservatory for undergraduate, and a pianist friend was Bulgarian and had ended up back in Sofia. And so I felt like I knew one person, and somehow that made it less frightening to make the leap. But it did feel like a leap. And, and I never expected to stay 4 years. But it's hard to explain. I mean, I do think the relationship between, my sort of writerly sensibility, and I am a writer who responds very much to place. I mean, I think place is the fundamental of sort of what motivates me to write. And it's hard to explain the kind of chemistry that one feels or doesn't feel with a place. It really is the same as with a person. And from the very first moment in Bulgaria, really, I mean, I did feel that there was this charge about the place, that something in me responded to it. And in some way, I guess writing the novel was a way of trying to figure out what that was, why I kept feeling so sort of profoundly challenged and moved and provoked by this place that I knew nothing about. I genuinely knew nothing about before I became interested in the job. I mean, I don't think I could have found Bulgaria on the map, very much to my shame.
I will say, when I started the novel, I read nothing about it beforehand. And wasn't 100% sure for the first couple pages whether it was just a fictional Eastern European country of no name or if it was an actual before I finally, this is actually Bulgaria.
Right,
okay.
Yeah.
I thought maybe it was like Metropole, that novel by
That's right,
Karenthi, where it's just, which I mentioned to last week's guest, is what I believe Hungarians experience when they're out in the rest of the world, because their language is so radically different than anyone else's.
Like linguistically.
Yeah, they're always one step removed at a minimum from the rest of us. But,
that's fascinating.
Yeah, that's just me and my too much time on my hands when I'm reading. Did you help at all with the translation, the Bulgarian translation of this?
Well, I fought very, very hard for the translator that I wanted, who was a translator I worked with very closely the summer before the process of publishing the book in Bulgarian began, when I did a poetry conference in Bulgaria, organized by the Elizabeth Kostova Foundation, which is a literary foundation in Bulgaria and the United States. And they paired poets, which, I don't write poetry anymore, but for 15 years, that was what I thought of myself as. But they paired poets with translators, and I got to work with a woman who I knew, who was already a friend and whose writing I respect very much, named Nadia Radulova. And working with her on these poems was a remarkable experience. She's very demanding of herself, but also there are particular challenges that this novel presents and that my poems presented for her, because the history of Bulgarian as a literary language, and especially the history of queer people in Bulgaria, is so different from the history of those things in English. And there were two main challenges. One is that there is not a history of writing the body and writing the sexual body in Bulgarian literature. And so, when thinking about, I do think it's one of the sort of great gifts of writing in English is that English became a literary language, a self-consciously literary language with Chaucer. And from the very beginning, cock and cunt and fuck were all words that were given a literary context. Sure. And of course, Shakespeare, does the same. And there's a way in which an enormous range of registers was accommodated within English as a literary language, really from the very beginning of the self-consciously literary tradition in English. That's an incredible gift to a writer, so that, you can use a word like cock and have it sort of, there is a way in which that does not break a kind of particular texture. Whereas in Bulgaria, there are kind of two sets of words for these things, one of which is clinical and medical, and the other of which is pornographic in a way that doesn't really touch the literary.
Okay.
And so that's a real challenge, to sort of then find these words that are going to have something of the same feeling as the words in English. And then the other challenge is that, gay slang and gay discourse doesn't exist in Bulgarian in the way that it does in English, just because they don't have the centuries-long tradition of queer people talking about themselves and talking to one another that English has. And so this is maybe only comes up a little bit in the book, but in these poems, there were sort of moments that were very camp. And I watched this very brilliant poet in her own language and a very brilliant translator kind of invent these resources. And at the public reading, at which there were a lot of my friends who are Bulgarian writers, they were just astonished. They would hear me read the poem in the English, and then she would read it. And at certain lines, I would sort of see their eyes light up.
They got the connection and the connotation.
She had solved a problem. And so I knew I wanted her to be my translator, and then I knew that I wanted the very brilliant Bulgarian writer who also is an important journalist in English named Dimitar Kanarov. I wanted him to be the editor. Once I got that in place, once I sort of coerced them both to do it, then I was very hands-off because I knew between them they would make it right. And they did. I mean, when reading the translation is pretty extraordinary because I do feel like, I feel my own sentences in the Bulgarian, which is also a challenge because Bulgarian syntax doesn't work like English syntax. Yeah. So it's really, really very brilliant. But I wasn't there sort of looking over her shoulder and, I knew she would do an excellent job.
Mm-hmm. And she wasn't sending any weird questions. And what you mean when you said?
No. Although she, one of the things that I loved about working with her on the poems was that she did ask all of those questions, and just really, I could see to what a kind of exact degree she was concerned with getting the temperature of a word right. Mm-hmm. And that's a wonderful thing to know your translator is thinking about.
Besides Bulgarian, any other languages for you? And I'm sure your Bulgarian is not fluent, but
my Bulgarian is not fluent. It's but it is really good. It's sort of getting less, with every
practice,
week I'm away, it gets less good, but it was really good. I could live in Bulgaria and I had relationships with people who didn't speak English, which made all sorts of things possible. I love learning languages. I mean, it is something I'm kind of addicted to. And I think that's also something that is in a weird way really important for my writing. That kind of space of consciousness in which you're constantly transacting between languages is something that just feels really rich with possibility for me. And there's a way in which, the way in which sort of speaking a language inexpertly makes language visible and malleable, and you become aware of language not just as a medium, but as matter itself, as something that you manipulate, as something that you have to work with. I think that's a really important, I think it's the necessary realization for an artist whose medium is language, to sort of take this thing that is unlike paint, unlike music, maybe that's more complicated, but sort of, language is the medium in which we move all the time. And I do think to be an artist, you have to become aware, to be an artist in that medium, you have to become aware of it as more than a medium, as in and of itself matter. And learning a foreign language, and I think learning a foreign language and classical singing, which was actually my earliest training in art, I think those are maybe the two most powerful ways to do that. So I also think, and something that I worry about for young writers and also for kind of the system we have created for the mentorship of young writers is that MFA programs very seldom include a serious component of language learning. And I think English, because English is a global language in a way that no other language has ever been, and there's a kind of pervasiveness of English that has just never existed before, a kind of total dominance of one language. I think there is a way in which native speakers of English, feel like they don't need to know other languages. I think that's deadly. I think that's deadly for literature as an art. If you look at the history of English literature, at sort of every point of greatest fecundity and innovation, that innovation has been spurred by the collision between languages and cultures. So, English became, this is too simple, obviously, an account, but it's not an entirely false account to say that English became a self-consciously literary language because Chaucer was reading lots of Boccaccio. And the Renaissance finally crossed the English Channel because Wyatt was reading Petrarch. And, Romanticism happened in England because Coleridge was reading German philosophy. And modernism happened because Eliot was reading French poetry and Pound was reading everything. all of these collisions between languages. And I worry that so few of my peers, I recently did the program in Iowa, so few of my peers read fluently in other languages. Not to mention the sort of the fact that translation is so that translation is so undervalued, I think, in an English language literary culture. But reading in other languages, it just seems like that's not something that writers take for granted they should be able to do. I think it's really important. And you know, this book would not exist in the same way had I not been reading Georgy Gospodinov and Teodora Dimova and Nikolai Boykov and, you know, these Bulgarian writers. They are in the book. That just feels really important. Yeah.
Along those lines, can you talk about your involvement in the Festival Neue Literatur, and which is sort of the reason we're here,
right,
at least to begin with. But can you talk about how that mission ties into what you're doing with FNL?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, I think it's a festival that creates a space for conversations between writers working in different countries and in different languages, and also between those writers and translators, because it is a festival that highlights translation. Susan Bernovsky is going to be speaking at the opening ceremony. Susan Bernovsky, whose work I think is really extraordinary. I've just been reading her translations of Jenny Erpenbeck, and you know, they're so brilliant, and you really do have this sense. And since I don't read in German, you know, it really is just like this world is, you know, made available. And when you discover a major writer like Jenny Erpenbeck, who is a discovery for me, a recent discovery, I mean, there really is this sense of like this huge new space has been opened up, and you feel this immense gratitude. And so I do feel that for a translator like Susan Bernovsky. So, you know, so it's a festival that highlights translation, and it's a festival that fosters these conversations where in these panels, you know, these writers from different backgrounds working in different languages are going to come together and talk, and have conversations that feel now especially urgent. And I do think it's also important, and the reason that I was brought on as chairperson is because the focus of this year's festival is queer writers. And you know, I do think queerness inflects those conversations in interesting ways, or provides a space for those conversations. You know, one of the things that interests me about queerness, and one of the reasons that queerness has so often come under suspicion, is the way that it scrambles the usual lines of allegiance and affiliation. And so if you think of the Lavender Scare in the 1950s, when queer people were purged from government positions, that was in large part justified, or one of the arguments by which that was justified was that queer people will feel a loyalty to other queer people that will trump their loyalty to nation. Now, there's absolutely
But you see the same thing about Catholics and Jews
That's
and
right.
everyone
Well,
else.
You know, it's these interesting, you know, these identities that cut across usual boundaries. So religion can function that way as well. But, you know, this idea that queerness, you know, there's never been any evidence to suggest that has any truth value in the realm of politics, but in the realm of art, there's a lot of evidence, right? And I would argue that one of the reasons that queer literature and queer art have so often been on the vanguard and remain such, to me, remarkably vibrant and fecund sort of pursuits is the way in which that cosmopolitanism, I mean, the way in which, you know, queer artists have drawn from other queer artists across culture, across language, across time. You know, I love the story here of the house here in New York, well, in Brooklyn Heights, that house on Middle Street, where in the 1940s, this remarkable group of queer artists, many of them immigrants and refugees, found a place of safety in this very turbulent time. Those artists included people like Auden, people like Benjamin Britten, people like Klaus and Erika Mann, the children of Thomas Mann, who are all queer artists. And that space seems to me like a kind of ideal, or that space on Middaugh Street in the 1940s seems like a kind of ideal queer space. Or I think of my own history as a reader. I mean, I think of the fact that when I was 14, I could go to Holly Cook Bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky, and stand in front of the lesbian and gay literature section. And as a kid who had no literary training in Kentucky public schools, choose basically at random, not just books by Edmund White and James Baldwin, but also books by Mishima and books by Genet, and, read these stories that were from worlds and lives very different from mine and still feel like in some way, however reflected and mediated through various kinds of difference, they were telling me my own story. That's a very powerful thing. And I do think that gives a particular charge to these kinds of conversations. I think at this moment, when the dream of cosmopolitanism, the dream of spaces that foster those kinds of conversation is under extraordinary attack, really probably a kind of attack it hasn't faced in this country for 7 decades. It just feels like very urgent work. Mm-hmm. It does feel like it's a really important time to value conversations that cut across nation and cut across language.
Do you feel, and this is going to be on the heels of last week's podcast where I interviewed Jessa Crispin about her new book, Why I Am Not a Feminist Manifesto, in which her complaint is that feminism, contemporary feminism, has become too involved in identity politics and assimilation, with, to boil it down unfairly, the idea that success means white women can now basically be assimilated into the same, grotesque capitalist system that white men are part of. Yeah. Do you feel is there a sort of danger of that within the various queer sectors, in terms of our idea of success is having mundane heteronormative lives?
Sure.
We can have marriage, we can be in the military,
yeah,
but
absolutely. I mean, I do think there's a danger that, especially for
like it's assimilation versus, I want my own radical life.
Right.
And this is,
I mean, and this has always been a tension in the queer movement. I think it's always a tension in any kind of minority rights movement. Mm-hmm. I mean, the extent to which purchasing necessary rights comes at the cost of mainstreaming and of sort of sacrificing what is particular to an identity or a culture. I do think that's a danger. I think it's a special danger, when you think about white gay men who have been excluded from all kinds of privilege because of their queerness. And now that's not so much the case. Mm-hmm. And, when I do see, gays for Trump, I do think that is, one kind of extraordinary, and it seems like an extraordinary blindness. But it does seem to be that phenomenon of, oh, hey, we can be a kind of suburban American family like any other.
One of the greatest Onion headlines of all time, gay couple has banal sex.
Right.
Which exactly. Looks better in print.
That's great. And that is, and I do think, it's a very sad thing to imagine that the kinds of solidarity and what we would now call intersectionality that characterized the most inspiring moments of the LGBT movement, certainly not universally, certainly not sufficiently. But that idea that, queerness was a point of contact, a point of solidarity across other kinds of difference, it's quite despairful to think that idea would be sacrificed to a desire for assimilation.
Or the back way of doing that, which is I'm doing it, therefore this is the queering of subject X or subject Y, which is, again, part of Jess's thing that, you know, a woman says, well, because I'm doing this, that makes it feminist, which again, essentially makes it meaningless at that point.
Yeah, it does essentially make
over-queering,
I
suppose.
I mean, I do think there is a value in that, in the idea that queerness can be a kind of repository for values that are essentially antagonistic with mainstream values. And, you know, one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book in which cruising plays an important role, and one of the reasons that I continue to explore cruising in my writing, as in my life, is that it does seem like a way of thinking about community, a way of thinking about intimate relations that is in touch with that radical potential of queerness to scramble the usual categories of difference and of identification. So that, I mean, when I think about my own experiences, you know, which were the experiences that provided me with a meaning for, you know, my life as a gay man, my own cruising experiences when I was 14 in Cherokee Park in Kentucky, you know, I mean, I had encounters with kinds of people that everything in my life was organized to prevent me from ever meeting. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, I had profound experiences, not just across racial difference, which was, you know, and continues to be in Kentucky a line of segregation, but even more across class difference. And that just seems extraordinarily valuable to me, to sort of have this space, and a space that is, you know, kind of beyond the gaze of authority, where human beings have face-to-face encounters. And I think anytime human beings have face-to-face encounters, there is the potential for, you know, the engagement of the whole gamut of emotional and ethical response. That seems to me remarkable and worth preserving. And you know, I do think that if a mainstreaming of, you know, queer identity, and if marriage equality comes at the cost of that, then the cost is too high. Yeah.
As someone who, well, the story I used to tell back around the turn of the century, there was an assistant editor at the old trade magazine I worked at who, we were out in the suburbs in New Jersey, who told me how decadent he was. Kid's like 24, 25, because he and his girlfriend hooked up with his ex-girlfriend. And at that point, I had been publishing fiction and journals of Samuel R. Delany for a little while. And I said, kid, have you ever, and then unloaded one of Delany's pedestrian afternoons in Times Square. And he just looked at me with shock and said, that's disgusting. I said, no, you're a white kid from the suburbs. You have no idea what's going on in this world, as don't I. I mean, I remember editing Chip Delany's journals. My girlfriend at the time was looking, why do you look so weird? I said, honey, you've had casual sex, right? She's like, yeah, you know, casual. I said, have you ever had anonymous sex with up to a dozen to 20 partners over the course of an afternoon? She's like, no. I'm like, yeah, okay. So we live in a different world, basically, and there's an understanding, you know, it's something that Fran Lebowitz has talked about, the sense of, especially as AIDS was becoming a phenomenon, particularly around New York when the bathhouse scene exploded into the media, that discovery of, oh wow, that's a very different world than heterosexual couples or, you know, individuals living in New York and the rest of the country imagined was around them.
Which is which is another thing that I love about cruising, which is that it does give this sense of kind of multiplicity to the world and to physical space, you know, because,
but also you mentioned the way you frame it as a universality of underground, the sense that you are under the palace in Sofia and you don't know Bulgarian at all, but you are comfortable with the codes of what it means when you walk into a bathroom and there's a guy or two.
I mean, it does, you know, it's interesting, because that did profoundly inflect my experience in Bulgaria. I mean, the fact that I think one of the reasons, you know, I think I did sort of delve more into Bulgarian culture and Bulgarian society, and also Bulgarian language, you know, because I learned the language much more than any of my American colleagues did. I think, you know, one of the things that made that possible was queerness. I mean, was the fact that, I met people I would never have met otherwise, because I was going to places like the bathrooms beneath the National Palace of Culture. And those experiences then, opened up, for instance, like I had acquaintanceships with Roma people in Sofia, because there were lots of Roma people in that bathroom, and I would have repeated contacts with them. And as Samuel Delany describes so well, I mean, these places, even these places that are largely characterized by anonymous sex, that doesn't mean that there's not a kind of that there aren't relationships that continue across time, and the sense of getting to know people.
I figure it's the same way the woman who runs the bagel stand in Newark Penn Station recognizes me even when I haven't been there for a few months, except with fewer, bodily fluids being exchanged. But yeah, nonetheless,
but yeah, I mean, there's a way in which, that opened a whole world that I would not have had access to otherwise. I love in Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, the way that Samuel Delany, talks about the fact that these porn cinemas in Times Square, they were the only places he had conversations with Hasidic Jews. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing space. That's an amazing space that allows for those kinds of conversations. And it does seem to me like there is, and one of the reasons I love that book so much, there are lots of reasons, but one of the reasons I love that book so much is because, he makes a strong claim, and I think a true claim, for the civic value, for the kind of public value of these spaces in which, in these spaces that are ambiguously public, these spaces that are to a certain extent beyond the public view or outside of the public view. I think that's true. But yeah, I felt very grateful for the access that queerness and that cruising gave me to the sorts of people I would never meet in my foreign and privileged life teaching at the American College of Sofia.
Did you ever get back to Kentucky?
That's been a very interesting thing about book tour. So I did not go back to Kentucky for many, many years. And then a couple of things happened. One was my father moved away. My father moved to Florida, which made the state feel available. And my youngest sister got married. And so that was the first time I had been back in over a decade. And that was just a couple of days. And that was in May. And then it was the following February that I was there for like 10 days as part of traveling for the book. And I was based in Louisville and went, to some places in Indiana and to Lexington, and was staying with my sister. And I was and got to experience Louisville in a way that I had not as a teenager, and also got to see the ways in which Louisville has changed. I mean, genuinely changed. And it's a place where I feel strongly I have to spend time there. I mean, I was shocked to find myself feeling the same kind of chemical charge I felt in Sofia. I was shocked to find myself feeling that in Louisville. And I know that means I have to spend time there. So I think in the next year or two, I have to sort of go back.
Did you ask the publisher to set up events in Kentucky, or was it just their own initiative?
I mean, it was one of the places that seemed obvious when we were talking about places to go. Mm-hmm. And, it was on the list of cities that made sense because the book is based there.
But you didn't put a big black X saying, I will never set foot in that state.
I didn't, although I think I would have if my father, I know I would have if my father were still living in Louisville, I wouldn't have gone back. But, the fact that he was away really did sort of take that X away and make me feel like I could go back. And now I was amazed by the kind of, I wasn't amazed to have a strong emotional response. And I wasn't amazed by some of the painful things I felt, but I was amazed by the positive things I felt. And by just how moved I was as someone who has, ever since I was 16, I'm now in my 4th year in Iowa City. I spent 4 years in Sofia. It's the longest I've ever lived anywhere since I was 16. And other than that, I've moved every 2 years. And so as someone whose life has been characterized by that, to go to a place and, have memories of, I was 5 years old and my father took me to this building. Mm-hmm. I was amazed by how moved I was. And it did present itself as something that I have to kind of write into. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know what that'll look like, but I know that a future project will take me to Louisville.
Not to ask too personal a question. Did you go cruising while you were there?
I didn't. And I wouldn't know where to.
You guys can figure it out, though.
We can figure it out. It's true. No, and that's not entirely true. I actually did stop at one place. I didn't cruise, but I wanted to see what it was like there. And that was a video store in southern Indiana where I had, when I was 16, these kinds of days and nights where I would have sex with 24 people. And that is still kicking. The park, though, where I spent most of my time, Cherokee Park, I don't know if cruising is happening somewhere else, but the old cruising places have been destroyed. The old cruising places have been destroyed, and the space is set up in such a way now as to prevent cruising. Yeah. So, cruising is still happening in Kentucky, but I would have to ask around or spend some time wandering with my antenna out, I guess, to figure out where it is. So I didn't cruise in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or not seriously.
Yeah. Just in a journalistic fashion.
Kind of. it was sort of like scouting, because I do know I'm going to have to, tackle this project, and it was kind of like scouting locations. I wanted to see if this place still exists, and it does. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Blanket statement on the state of queer fiction?
Really exciting.
Yeah.
I think really exciting. There are, I think 2016 was a year that had a lot of exciting queer books. I think 2017 looks like it's going to be a similar year, and maybe more so in terms of books in translation. So I think queer literature is I think there's a very vibrant, fecund conversation happening in the realm of queer literature right now.
Cool. Were you surprised by non-queer audience picking up on your book?
Very much so. But I really was surprised by any audience.
Certainly. But at least you figured there's a built-in audience
for that. Gay guys will want to read a book about a gay guy. Yeah.
But not explicitly graphic also, again, from a guy who published Samuel Delany.
Right.
I was like, oh, okay, this is, I don't want to say tame, but tame.
But it is.
Compared to 1980s New York.
This is one of the, this is one of the things that surprised me in response to the book is, people who would say to me oh, these sex scenes are so brave. And I would be like, what are you talking about? And I did say to some people, I was like, you should read Samuel Delany, actually. If you should sort of see what's really, I do think I don't think there's absolutely not anything outrageous in the book in terms of the sex scenes. It does say something about our moment and maybe about how much our culture and our literary culture have changed since the 1970s and 80s. Certainly since the 1970s, that a book like mine, which has 2 or 3, sort of detailed sex scenes, no extraordinary sex acts. Mm-hmm. In fact, I've published a story in the Paris Review that is much more graphic and does have fetishistic sex and stuff like that. The novel has none of that. Yeah. And yet it could still be received with shock. And people would say, wow, it's so brave to write these scenes.
Again, because white people in the suburbs have no goddamn idea.
Well, that's kind of true. Well, and also, but a lot of that came from the UK, where they have Alan Hollinghurst who writes, he does write descriptively and very well about sex.
And we know that all upper-class Englishmen are actually homosexual, but I'm just kidding.
Or at some point in their lives.
Yeah, at least in private school they had some experience.
Yeah, that's the fantasy anyway. So it did take me aback. And I think it does say something about the culture that sort of we're fighting. I mean, I remember one of the most high-profile interviews I did. It was a radio interview. One of the most high-profile interviews I did began with the question, why, after decades in which gay men's lives have been reduced to sex, would you begin your book in a bathroom? And I just thought, I thought several things. One of them being, it's not the fact that gay men have sex or where they have it that reduces the value of their lives, but instead the kind of homophobic argument impacted in your question. Mm-hmm. But also that, wow, we're really going to have this conversation. We really have to have this conversation again. And that in that case, that was coming from a straight person, but those questions have come from gay people too. And in some sense, I do think that this is a response to kind of the mainstreaming of queer culture, that these gay men who would say,
Don't make them think we're all like this.
Yeah, and why can't we have books about happy gays and relationships? I'm like, we do have those books, and we should have those books, and we should have more of those books. But don't pretend that that's not happening. And then I remember the most striking question I got, or a question that has stuck with me. This guy who, as he asked it, was like visibly shaking. He was angry. He was so angry at the book in a way that many gay men, or some gay men, have been angry at the book. And he said, why can't your narrator just be an open and proud gay man? And I was so taken aback by it, because I said, my narrator is an open and proud gay man. Yeah. I mean, what are you talking about? And he's open, in a place where that's much more difficult than it is here in the United States. And, what is it? The fact that the book is invested in the exploration of shame, and the fact that the book wants to look at queer shame, is something that, and I understand this, but is something that causes people anger and pain. And that's very telling, I think, that, as a part of this sort of mainstreaming discourse of queerness, there has been such an emphasis placed on pride. And this is a way in which, I feel very ambivalent about these things, because I think the discourse of pride has been politically necessary. I think the discourse of pride has also been life-saving. I mean, certainly to me as a kid in Kentucky, when I was 14, 15, 16, it was very important that this discourse was being articulated somewhere, not anywhere particularly close to me, but somewhere. Yeah. And that, I knew that it was being articulated somewhere. And at the same time, when that becomes constraining, when that becomes coercive, and when that causes us to sort of be unable to talk about, whole realms of feeling, I think that is dangerous. And I think it's also, I think that's damaging, I do think I wanted in this book to create a space where we could talk about, where I could think about, what shame feels like to an open and proud gay man, what that shame feels like to someone who is shaped by these lessons he's disavowed. That felt like a meaningful thing to do in a queer book now, to sort of think about that particular shape of queer subjectivity.
Do you feel you're a generation older? Do you feel the younger generation of gay men even see it in that light, or is the shame always individual and just based on family circumstances, etc.? Or do you think the progress made within the culture in general has made it easier for someone maybe 10, 15 years younger than you?
Oh, I think easier, sure. Yeah. I hope that's the case. But I do think it's important to remember that kind of progress is still, restricted to places of extraordinary privilege.
The cosmopolitanism.
Yeah, that's
earlier.
right.
Yeah.
Being queer in New York is a very different experience still today from being queer in Kentucky, is a very different experience from being queer almost anywhere else in the world.
Sure.
And then I do think there is something about, the particular way in which, queerness, the way in which queer kids are still almost always born into straight families, and the way in which the experience of discovering queerness, it's hard for me to imagine, even as stigma is taken away from queerness, it is hard for me to imagine that the experience of coming into an awareness of yourself as queer will be separate ever from an experience of difference and an experience of recognizing that your life is not going to fill the most immediate models you have for what a life should look like.
Sure.
And that, and that particular experience of queer desire, which is something that I think, is something that actually I'm quite grateful for, especially as a queer man, because I do think there's a dangerous lesson that men are still taught about desire in this culture, which is that desire carries a kind of permission. I think that was extraordinarily on display in the Trump recording, right? Yeah. Where he says, I just grab them by the pussy. I don't even ask. I just grab them. I mean, that idea that if I desire something, that desire carries with it a permission to grab the thing that I desire. I can't imagine a queer person feeling that, I mean, I do think that queer desire, the first experience of desire, so often carries with it a kind of prohibition and a sense of exclusion. And that, I mean, again, that does seem to me like shame. It seems to me something that has real value. That's the other side of the shame conversation, that I think shame is a really valuable feeling, and it's really dangerous to just push it away, without thinking about the kinds of work it can do. I feel the same way about that kind of difference, that it's hard for me to imagine ever not marking queerness, even in these places of great privilege. I do think, that said, I mean, I hope very much, and I do think it's the case, that in some very privileged parts of the world, queer kids grow up with an entirely different sense of horizon of possibility. I do think that's true, and I do think it's going to be interesting to see what those books look like. But I don't think, I don't think the feeling of queerness as difference is going to just disappear. And two, there's sometimes been the argument that, if stigma is lifted and if we do reach kind of maximum assimilation, that queerness will just disappear, that sort of it will stop being an identity. I think that depends on an argument that queerness is purely a kind of antagonistic, that queerness as an identity is a kind of response to an antagonistic world, that it's a response to oppression. I don't believe that. I think queerness is also a site of celebration and possibility and all of those things. But I also don't think, I think we are very far from actually living in a world that is honestly described by the very flattering story we tell ourselves in this country about queer rights. Although, we're not telling that story so robustly now in the age of Trump.
Yeah. So I did notice that I think one of the biggest changes from the interviews you did when the book came out a year ago to now was a number of people asking about the, triumph of gay rights, et cetera. And I guess we were all thinking we're on that same arc of history.
It's a really, really important reminder.
Yeah.
And, it's a really important reminder that idea that, the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice is beautiful and true, so long as we remember that it's not the universe that's bending, but instead an act of our own will and imagination. And I think we are discovering now, or realizing again now, and maybe this is just a cyclical process where, every few decades we have to be reminded, we have to relearn it. But that the idea of civil rights, the idea of citizenship, the idea of legal personhood, these are all fictions. They are all imaginative acts. And they require a constant exercise of the imagination and of political will to maintain. And I do think that and this is something I'm talking about in my opening remarks at the festival, I do think that the dream of liberal democracy has been to define a certain set of rights and protections adhering to legal persons, and then to expand the category of legal persons so that that category is applied more broadly and uniformly. That has been the dream of liberal democracy, that is the dream expressed in the idea that the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends towards justice. That's what that means. Now we are seeing how powerful, and again, in a way that I don't think we've seen for 7 decades, how powerful is the desire not to expand, but to restrict that category, and to say we are going to put up a wall, and on one wall are persons, and on one side of the wall are persons, and on the other side of the wall are non-persons. And how easy that is for us to do. That there is nothing necessary, there is nothing natural in this idea we've had of progress. There's nothing natural in the idea of human rights. There is nothing more natural to human beings than to point at another human being and say, that is not a person. That is our nature. And, and the idea of, building walls, this is a very old idea, of course. We build walls to keep out barbarians. And of course, what we find are that we are ourselves the barbarians. And these legal fictions are our best defense against the barbarians that we are. I think, we are seeing just how much it is in our nature to not do that, to exclude, to, want to strip from human beings that category of personhood. I do think it's a really terrifying moment. I mean, I find myself frightened in a way that I have really never been in my own country. Mm-hmm. And that's where we are.
The notion that Germany is the defender of liberal democracy in 2017 compared to almost any other country out there is sort of mind-blowing to me, given family history. That's where I'm coming from. But,
well, I mean, it is a reminder of just how mobile these ideas we have are. The idea that America is the land of the free, the idea that the president of the United States is the leader of the free world. Yeah. This is a very mobile concept.
Yeah, it turns out it's not as quite as valid as we are.
Yeah, and to me it's remarkable that, we are looking to Angela Merkel, who,
came up in East Germany.
Who has also been behind policies that have been responsible for a great deal of the suffering in Europe. Especially in the suffering of in causing suffering in the poorer parts of Europe. Yeah. That now she holds this mantle of standing for these, this idea that human beings should be legal persons and that we should not wall off entire parts of the world with, bans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last question. What was the literature you were reared on? Gay or straight?
I wasn't really reared on literature.
Yeah. What did you discover, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, when I was in high school, I did discover people through that lesbian and gay literature section. And then when I was in college, I discovered poetry in a serious way. And I think who I am as a writer really owes a great deal to the poets that I discovered and loved. That's really the literature that I was reared on, the literature that I sort of was conscious of as literature. Mm-hmm. But I grew up in a house without a lot of books. And when I read as a kid, I read fantasy and science fiction and, things that, and not like good, not like.
Oh, trust me, I was reading the stainless steel rat stories and things like that all this years.
It's not like I was reading the science fiction that's sort of intellectually ambitious and,
the canonical, great stuff.
Yeah, that's right. No, I was reading I was reading like books about, wizards and things. I didn't start reading seriously until my last couple of years in high school. In fact, I was just at the Interlochen Arts Academy where I went when I was 16. I was just back there reading last week. And And, I remembered it was there because there was this crazy woman teaching literature who's still there, and I got to have dinner with her, and I owe her so much, named Jean Gady, who taught a course in Russian literature in which we read the Brothers Karamazov and like all of these things. And I'm like, when I was 17, I had no idea.
I don't think this would have meant anything to me then.
I mean, but what it did do, was it kind of showed me how big a book could be. I mean, in terms of the scope of it, in terms of what it could hold and what a book could do. And then I had this model, even as I was myself baffled, I had this model of this wonderful woman who, was so impassioned about it. And I think that's the moment when I took that class with Jean Gady at the Interlochen Arts Academy. That was the moment when I realized what a book could do and why it was worth paying attention to.
Did she read your novel?
She did read it, yeah.
What did she say?
I mean, very, it's...
I can't believe you would write something like this.
Yeah, no, quite the contrary. No, she would not be someone with that kind of response.
No.
It's of course, it's just the most moving thing, to have the person who showed me what literature could do, say that she found value in reading my book. I mean, it's just the most extraordinary thing. And I feel very grateful.
That sounds great. Garth Greenwell, thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you.
And that was Garth Greenwell. His first novel, that lousy son of a bitch with a really good debut novel, and he's younger than me, his novel is What Belongs to You, which recently came out in paperback from Picador. You can visit his website, garthgreenwell.com, to find out more about him, his writing, appearances, events, other interviews, none of them as good as mine, and more. And that's GarthGreenwell. He's also on Twitter as Garth Greenwell. As I mentioned at the top, Garth is a chairperson for this year's Festival Neue Literatur, which will take place March 2nd through 5th, 2017, in Manhattan and Brooklyn. You can look that up online at festivalneuliteratur.org. New is N-E-U-E, and literature is like literature, except without the E on the end. And festival is festival. Good luck with that. There'll be a link in the show notes. You can find it there and click through. But I'm going to try to get there for the kickoff event on Thursday. I've got a big hearing down in Washington that I need to be at that morning. But, we'll see if I can make it back up in time. Sunday, I'll also be in for one of the panels so that I can interview one of the authors beforehand. From how the event went last year, it's a really well-organized and pretty entertaining literary festival, I guess. I hope to see you there. And if you're listening to this months after the show came out, sorry. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked Garth, so, who are you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our monthly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. You can do that at patreon.com/VMSpod. or at paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for supporters of the show, including that podcast. You can go back and listen to the other dozen of them that I've already done. There's a patron-only blog. You can get access to the handwritten show notes for every episode, which are pretty scary in their way. I'm looking to launch a series of ebooks soon, and there'll be more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, this episode was recorded at an apartment in the West Village in Manhattan. So that involved a toll at the GW, about $20 for parking, and a $5 tip because the parking garage was filled, but the attendant decided to let me stay anyway and put the car somewhere where he could get it really easily when I finished. Also a $6 round trip on the subway. Plus coffee and a ginormous donut at Birch on 7th Avenue. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, insulin, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Speaking of donors, special thanks go out to our high roller donors, Paul W. Jones, Kevin Katila, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Zach Martin, Craig P. Steffen, and Ron Slate for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We've got the full list of show supporters on the website at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode, as ever, is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. David has a reunion project going with his great 80s band, David and David. You can find out more and support that at facebook.com/davidanddavidmusic. And that's it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Barbara Epler, the publisher and editor-in-chief of New Directions and winner of the 2017 Friedrich Ulfers Prize at the Festival Neue Literatur. Until next time, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store or at soundcloud.com/VMSpod. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, on Facebook at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, and at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for this podcast. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Until next time, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.